welcome to the Murphy Institute.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Carmen. I'm sitting with Carmen Berkeley. She is a radical civil and labor rights activist, a writer, a trainer who currently serves as the youngest director of the Civil, Human, and Women's Rights Department at the AFLCIO. We are here today because we're going to be a part of a panel on confronting the tragedy, law enforcement, unionism, and communities of color. So let me just ask you a question. In view of the fact that the AFL-CIO represents both civilian employees and uniformed service employees, what is the discussion like right now at the national level of the AFL-CIO on this whole situation of very increasing high-profile shootings across the country, and what is the AFL see itself as a possible playing a role towards a solution?
Thank you for asking me that question. And, you know, I think that what properly sums up how the AFL-CIO is dealing with this issue, if you go back to right after Mike Brown was killed, our President Richard Trumka, actually went to St. Louis. He was doing a speech, and he said a famous line, "Our brother killed our sister's son." And, you know, those words were so powerful and so captivating. There were some folks that were applauding what President Trumka said because they felt like, finally, you know, we are being honest as a labor movement around this dichotomy that we have, which is we do represent law enforcement. We do represent people like Leslie McSpadden, who is Mike Brown's mother. She's also a member of United Food and Commercial Workers. And so I think for us, we actually cannot run away from this as an issue. We can't run away from it, because we do represent law enforcement. We do need law enforcement in this country. But, you know, we've actually seen models of talking about law enforcement and bringing in, you know, rank and file members who feel, you know, completely opposite to how law enforcement are operating. And I say that because we work on criminal justice reform at the AFL-CIO. So I get the opportunity to work with corrections officers. I get the opportunity to work with people who are formerly incarcerated. And one would think, oh, if you bring those two groups of people into the room, you know, obviously, you know, something terrible is going to erupt. Except that's not what's happened. Over the past 3 years, we've been working with corrections officers and people who are formerly incarcerated. They have worked together to come up with what is the agenda that we want to move forward. We want to make sure that both workers are feeling safe on the job, and we also want to make sure that people who are currently and formerly incarcerated actually have rights. And I think if we approach any type of conversation around police unions and how do we as a labor movement, you know, address some of the systemic issues that are happening, I think it has to be the labor movement bringing these two groups together, because obviously we represent these two groups. But even outside of that, you know, I think that we have more in common than we don't have in common as communities. I mean, obviously within labor, we always take on challenging issues. That is what the labor movement is about. So when people say to me, oh, well, you know, we shouldn't actually be talking about these issues, we should be talking about something else, the labor movement never runs away from a hard fight. And so I think this is one of those hard fights that we can't run away from.
That's interesting. I mean, look, Trumka has a long history of speaking out on race. During the 2008 presidential, he, you know, very eloquently addressed white workers on the question of race and where their interests lie. But unions, as a practical matter, deal in the areas of collective bargaining. Is there any discussion at the national level of things that could be bargained for with police unions in order to, one, allow them to engage the community in a different way? Part of what seems to be happening is we've had several forums here. When Reverend Sharpton was here once, and he said in every instance where there's been one of these police shootings across the country, the police uniformed services have never spoken out and said the officer was wrong. Now some of that is rooted in their duties of fair representation. Is there any discussion about where we go with this as the institution of the union to try to alleviate some of the pressures on police officers to allow some flexibility in this discussion?
Well, I think that what the AFLCIO and what our department, the Civil, Human, and Women's Rights Department, has been able to do is open up an even broader conversation around what is the role that race has played in dividing working people. So one of the things we said, like, after the Mike Brown instance, is how does the labor movement even address issues pertaining to racial justice? Because oftentimes, unfortunately, we've turned our heads to some of the most egregious things that have happened in American history. And so we decided that we would actually have a commission on racial and economic justice, where we would not only address what are some of the issues that you are having in your community around law enforcement, but what are some of the issues that people of color and white workers are having. So we know in our history, people have always used race to divide working people. Right to work laws. I mean, the entire genesis of right to work laws was around, Muse, who started it, basically trying to pit white workers against black workers. So for us, we cannot mandate to police unions, or really to any union, how they should necessarily operate. But what we can do is open up a much broader conversation around how do their actions affect other workers? How do their actions prevent people that we want to be a part of the labor movement from coming because people feel like we have an implicit or an explicit bias? When I hear, there was a young man that we talked to in Minneapolis from the building trades, and he said, a black man, he said, I have to wake up 2 hours early for work in order to mentally prepare for the racism that I'm going to have to deal with when I get onto the work site. So for us, yes, we should totally be focusing on police unions and how can we help, strengthen their collective bargaining contracts. But I think on the other end, it's not just the police that have a race problem. It's actually all of us that have a race problem and uncomfortability with talking about race. And that's the conversation that we want to open up.
Terrific. But there are some real tensions. And it's not confined to urban settings. For instance, the Border Patrol officers have basically denounced the AFL-CIO's position on immigration. They're part of the American Federation of Government Employees. They're an important affiliate to the AFL-CIO.
Yes.
Is there any direct conversation that begins to take place when one of the organizations goes off the ranch like that?
Well, I'll give you an example. In San Diego, so yes, Border Patrol has, decided that they're going to endorse Trump. But you also have examples of law enforcement, ICE officers in San Diego that are a part of a much broader coalition in the state of California, an interfaith network that works with faith, they work with community, it's labor, and it's law enforcement working together to try to determine what are some of the laws that need to change, what are some of the practices that we actually need to look at. And to me, it's always great to be able to come down from Washington, D.C. and tell people all of our intellectual thoughts, but I actually think that's not the strategy that we should employ. Where we have seen a lot of change has been at the local level, where faith, community, and law enforcement and the broader labor movement have come together to say, let's find commonality. And that's why having forums like this is so important, for us to be able to open up a conversation, as scary sometimes as trying to incubate these conversations are, and saying, but we actually have more in common than we think we do. And there are so many outside cultural factors that are splitting our communities apart. So if they can figure it out in a place like San Diego, where there's obviously a lot of immigrants, there's obviously a lot of law enforcement, and they haven't gotten it perfect yet, but what the law enforcement officers down there have said is, we have made a good faith commitment, and when there are major issues that come up, we're going to address them through this coalition. And I think that is a model that we need to try to figure out how we move forward.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.